You're listening to Discography Discussion, episode 229, Exodus, hosted by Dan Terry.
In my opinion, it's the heaviest and the most technically sound.
And Joseph Wren. Sometimes you just gotta be ridiculous. Presented by discussmetal.com. And if you do the toxic waltz with thigh-high waiters, then you are ready for this episode of Discography Discussion. I am Joe. That is Dan.
What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Discography Discussion. Tonight, it is going to get very thrash metal.
That's one way of putting it. I'm reminded of that time we talked about Dan's favorite thrash band. What were they called again, Dan?
What, Living Sacrifice?
No, your favorite thrash band.
Sepultura?
I believe I was referring to Testament.
Oh yeah, well, Testament, sure. I like a lot of thrash bands. I'm kind of a big fan of the style. Not always obvious, but I am.
So here we are talking about Exodus, one of the best thrash bands that you will ever listen to. Spoilers, they don't fuck up. Spoilers, they don't take themselves seriously all the time. You know that thing Anthrax gets credit for, being the jokers of the Big Four? Much like Testament, I'm going to ask the question again. Why isn't Exodus part of the Big Four?
I think the Big Four is just a word that people throw out there. If you're a big fan of thrash metal, you know that like there's more out there than just Metallica, Megadeth, Anthrax, and Slayer, right?
Absolutely.
If you're a fan of thrash metal, then you listen to Exodus, you listen to Testament, you listen to Creator, you listen to early Sepultura, you know. And yeah, you know what? You listen to Living Sacrifice too. I'll give it to them. That was a damn fine thrash record they put out.
Yeah, there was that one time they kind of sounded like Slayer.
Yep. What about Sodom? We need to talk about them, but they've got like 27 million records. So like that could take some time to get through. Or maybe not. You know, it depends on how fast they're playing on that record. And Exodus is a band that, yeah, absolutely gets overshadowed by bigger bands like Metallica. Kirk Hammett from Metallica was actually in Exodus for a couple of minutes in like 1982. He recorded on their demo with them and then I guess got a better job, or at least a higher paying job. I don't know what it paid to be in Metallica back in 1983. That's an interesting question that probably will never get answered unless we talk to somebody from Metallica, which, you know, we'll see. Maybe.
I think we can pull it off. Somewhere in there's a salary that no one knows about except the band. I think the closest thing we'll ever get to that is Rob Trujillo's segment where he became the bass player in that documentary where they said, and I quote, "We want to give you $1 million." And that's where Rob Trujillo said, "I'm in."
Sounds good to me, man. Yeah, 100%. And you know, with Exodus, what I love about Exodus is they're always the underdogs. You know, even Testament sometimes gets put up on this pedestal of being, you know, the greatest thing to ever happen to thrash. And I believe that, but I also believe that Exodus was a damn fine thing to happen to thrash. And I think that they actually set themselves apart. There are a lot of thrash bands that sound like every other thrash band out there. You have your Slayer clones. You've got a billion Metallica clones out there. For some reason, everybody wants to be Overkill. For some reason. But Exodus has a bass that is more in kind of that classic Metallica sound, like the Kill 'Em All sound, the pre-Lightning. And so you always wonder, like, what would that band have sounded like had they kind of stuck with that style and innovated on that style? Whereas obviously Metallica went in a little bit more of a commercial direction after that. Exodus is kind of like keeping it fast, keeping it intense, keeping it in your face, and having a great time while doing it.
Well, before Dan decides it's a good day to die, I'm going to take this time to say thank you to everyone for listening to the podcast. Thank you for listening and for subscribing. If you are not a subscriber, then you can find everything Discography Discussion at discussmetal.com. We are on Spotify, Apple and Google Podcasts, TuneIn Radio, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, twitch.tv/discussmetaldan for all your game streaming needs. So if you have an Amazon Echo or a Google Home, you have no excuse. Ask it to play the latest episode of the Discography Discussion podcast, and it will. We're also on Facebook and on Twitter at Discuss Metal. Be sure to like, favorite, and subscribe. It really helps us out. It lets us know you're listening. And now Dan is going to tell us all about 5-star reviews.
We do enjoy reading reviews on the show. You have to leave us one to get us to review it. A whole bunch of people have left reviews in the past, and, well, we've read them. So we will continue to read your reviews on Apple Podcasts or on Facebook. Anywhere else, just drop us a line. I'll give you a lot of information on how to drop us a line at the end of this episode.
So, Dan, tell me about Exodus.
Exodus. Well, I'm glad that we're getting into this finally. I think I promised that we were going to do an Exodus episode during the Metallica episode, which was like our first episode ever. That was 4 years ago. So, we're getting around to it now, eventually. Exodus is a American thrash metal band formed as far back as 1979. They are most famous for their single, The Toxic Waltz, which we will definitely get into whenever we get there.
Absolutely.
Exodus is just an in-your-face thrash metal band. They have always been that. They will always be that. Other than one relatively minor departure in the middle of their career, these guys have kept it heavy. They've kept it in your face. They've kept it offensive. They've kept it hilarious. And yeah, I can't wait. I can't wait to jump through these. This was an absolute pleasure to listen to all the way through. I know I'm already getting into my final thoughts, so I'll shut up so we can talk about the records.
1985, Bonded by Blood.
Yeah, man, that's the offensive cover. That's the one that there was like an overlay for this that you bought it. And it just had the name of the record on the front of it. This record is, I'm going to be honest with you, Joe, it sounds a lot like Kill 'Em All by Metallica. And that's not a bad thing for 1985. This record is very fast, very intense. Some of the fastest picking I've heard this side of Death Angel. And I mean, Bonded by Blood obviously is a classic record. No matter how much we talk about it, we're not going to do it justice. It is notable for having original, well, maybe not original singer, but recorded original singer Paul Bailoff on vocals. And he gives a very shouty, angry, Kill 'Em All Hetfield-esque sort of delivery on this record, and it just works, man. Blistering solos, fast speed metal segments. These guys thrash it out, and what I love about it too is that it does differentiate itself from something like a Slayer. I mean, even Slayer wasn't this heavy on their first record, This is so in your face. It's Kill 'Em All turned up by a couple of notches, and I can't get past it. I love the vocal delivery the most. It's more screechy and shouty than necessarily what you would get like with Slayer. I used to always joke it just sounds like a guy talking really fast, and kind of yelling. Exodus, it's just go for the throat vocally, and even though the band is going to have several vocalists going forward. That is never lost on any of these guys.
In 1985, I don't know anyone except Megadeth who was trying to release an album that very deliberately sounds like Kill 'Em All. That's not to say that Megadeth was trying to put out an album that sounds like Kill 'Em All. That was Dave Mustaine trying to prove a point that killing is his business. So why is Exodus in 1985 trying to release an album that very deliberately sounds like Metallica? The answer is jump on the bandwagon, and the bandwagon was good. At this point, we'd already gotten Ride the Lightning, and I don't have my dates in order, but Master of Puppets was on the way or had just come out. My point being, Exodus was creating thrash metal for thrash metal fans. And to have been there the day this album came out, to have heard it for the first time, and to have thrown it on top of the pile of CDs and cassettes that Dan and I are going to listen to for the rest of the day, this would have been a pleasure. This is one of those examples of the riffs are here, the frantic drumming is here, and the out-of-control vocal style that usually accompanies classic thrash. It's all there.
I agree with everything that you said, other than the jumping on the bandwagon. I think this is less I think this is less of a jumping on the bandwagon and more of a we're all from the same scene.
Agreed.
You know, you can't have a band that used to have Kirk Hammett in it and say that they're ripping off Metallica.
Well, let me be clear. I don't think the band was ripping off Metallica. I think somebody hired someone to record this album, and that person said, let's just make it sound like Kill 'Em All. And they went with it.
Fair enough.
Knowing where their humorous side goes, I can see that being a decision. Hey, guys, let's just make it sound like Kill 'Em All. All right.
Maybe. I mean, I find this record very, very enjoyable. It's a classic for me. But, speaking of pleasure.
Pleasure of the Flesh, 1987. Hail Videodrome, long live the new Flesh.
Here we go, man. This is awesome. This is the introduction to probably my favorite Exodus vocalist. He's probably been on the most records, and that would be one Mr. Steve Souza. Steve has a very noticeable, he has a very, very noticeably different vocal style than Paul did. And this is where, me and my friends, unfortunately, like to use the word frog vocals to describe a band. Not that it's like or anything, but it's like, I don't know why it reminds me of a frog, but it does. And that's really disrespectful because I actually really, really like his vocals. He sounds ultra sarcastic all the time. I would love to do like a impression, but I'm afraid that might be too offensive. But it's like if I say everything like this all the time, like it's evil, right? It's very evil, for thrash metal. But I like it because vocally, it's one of the things that sets the band apart from a lot of other thrash metal bands. I've heard there's another band, there's a Christian metal band actually called Ultimatum that basically verbatim copies this vocal style, and I can totally see why, because it just sounds cool. It sounds super metal. As far as the music goes, this one's a little bit more Exodus in character, I guess. This is where these guys are writing genuinely heavy riffs. I think some thrash bands back at this time weren't necessarily as concerned about heaviness as they were about speed. Whereas Exodus kept it super, super heavy and super, super fast. And like I said, I like the dude's vocals. I think the drumming is just absolutely in the pocket, to the point where some of these songs start going so fast, I'm afraid that they're about to fall apart.
You say it's evil sounding, but is it as evil sounding as King Diamond?
Well, that's a totally different kind of evil entirely. But I will say that, yes, I do actually think, this is just like my actual opinion, that I think Steve Souza sounds more evil than King Diamond.
Shots fired indeed. I'm kidding. We're sticking with the cosmetic similarities to those early Metallica records. I think that is a testament to Metallica going in the commercial direction that Dan mentioned earlier. Everybody talks about Metallica defining thrash and then moving away from it. I don't always agree, because when you hear a band like Exodus, who fully grasps what a thrash song is and continues to create it, to continue and write more songs that sound like thrash, that's a thrash band. That's not a heavy metal band who's trying to find their way into the pop area or the popular music area of the radio. And while a band like Metallica took years to do it, Exodus doesn't sound like they're trying to break. It sounds like they're just trying to be heavy. It sounds like they listen to some heavy metal records and go from there. Do I hear the classic 80s clips from movies in a lot of these songs too? It almost sounds electronic in places, like somebody has a synthesizer and we're going to make some bell noises and we're going to make some scraping sounds here and there. It almost sounds like a cheesy 80s horror movie sometimes. And that's something that Exodus does really well.
It's almost like a band like Exodus exists for the guy like me, where everybody's like, yeah, I love Metallica, I love Megadeth, I love, Slayer, I love Anthrax. And yeah, well, you know what, dude, the real thrash metal, that's Exodus. You know, it's unfortunate that they play that role, because I don't think that's what the intention was. I don't think that they wanted to be, you know, a ripoff of anybody. They just come across to me as a group of guys that just wanted to thrash out and have a great time, and they absolutely accomplished that on this record and on the next one.
Beautiful Disaster. I'm sorry, 1989. Fabulous Disaster.
Do you catch that? You catch that Megadeth poster? It looks like on the poster that Exodus is headlining and Megadeth is playing before them.
Did that ever happen?
I don't know. It makes me wonder if that. I think that's probably true. That's probably like a real poster. I mean, to say this many years later, whether that's true or not, I don't know. There could have been a time. But Fabulous Disaster is probably the most popular Megadeth. Not Megadeth. Wow.
Go in your
Fabulous
corner,
Disaster. Yeah. Right? Fabulous Disaster is probably the most popular Exodus album ever released, and that is due to probably their biggest song, which is, as we all know, The Toxic Waltz.
You know that song that the band writes that just defines everything about that band? That is The Toxic Waltz. It has the right amount of humor, the right amount of heavy, and the right amount of thrash that you know what you're listening to now when you hear Exodus. It doesn't sound like every other band in this scene. You know who you're listening to now when you hear the band. I like how the band starts to use narrations in the start of the albums here for the last one and this one.
Yeah.
Like they're setting that stage, that horror movie kind of atmosphere I was talking about. And that continues into this record. And maybe that's unfair because all those horror movies had somebody recording songs for them, and it makes sense that if you're recording at the same studio, you're going to have the same Marshalls and the same drums and the same reverb chambers. Not my point. It just fits in there. It's not like they're trying to break out of something that doesn't work. It's like they're embracing something because it works.
Yeah. And I think this works insanely well for 1989. This record, I feel like, was an interesting turning point for Exodus, where I think they were underdogs before this. I think this was their first big main shot at being more of a mainstream thrash band. I mean, I've got bad news for any thrash bands that made their way into the 90s, but we'll get to that. I think this is absolutely the pinnacle of the commercial viability of thrash metal. And this has some of the best riffs on it. The band's a little bit, they're slowed down a little bit in places. They're a little bit more understandable. Vocals are a little bit more understandable. They still sound evil, and I love that. I love his voice so much. It's kind of almost the reason I'm here most of the time. But you know, they have, you know, some songs. They're going for kind of longer, bigger songs like Father Like Son. They're gonna start playing much longer songs going forward, and this is where I feel like they have started injecting a little bit more complexity into their music than, say, a Metallica or a Megadeth. Exodus has some of the best riffing in the game, and it just blows my mind all these years later that the band isn't more known for that. For having some of the best riffs in thrash metal, like actual catchy riffs. Because, I mean, by this point, Slayer had gone full speed, right? Anthrax, I don't even want to talk about what Anthrax was doing, but like...
Hey, I'm the man, dude.
Yeah, okay. I don't know if I'm the man was in 89 or not, but I think, I want to say that was early 90s, but I don't listen to enough, whoever that band is, Anthrax, to really get into that, but... I don't know. This is probably the best Exodus record of their early career, but I am starting to wonder if the formula is starting to falter at all. You don't hear it on this record. I think this record's as close to perfect as you can get for an Exodus release. But going forward, I think we might have a little bit of issue.
So are you saying that impact is imminent?
That's exactly what I'm saying.
1990. It's like they knew.
Well, let me start off. by saying that Impact is Imminent is not a bad record. It is not as bad of a record as maybe a lot of music reviewers would have you believe. I actually think that the first song on the record, Impact is Imminent, is awesome, even though the lyrics are a little cheesy.
You're listening to Exodus, a band that clearly has humor. So yeah, if the lyrics are cheesy, that's fine. It's also 1990, where I wonder if the decision was, let's write a cheesy record because of how cheesy some of those music soundtracks and records were. I mean, look at the cover. It looks like we're about to embark on a VHS revolution.
I don't think that the lyrics are cheesy for the sake of being funny, though. I think that the lyrics are cheesy because it seems to just be like an anti-drunk, like obviously an anti-drunk driving song. I mean, which is fine. I'm not saying that, like, if you're against drunk driving that you're cheesy or anything, but I don't know, just the way it sounds. Steve's vocals sound a little bit more like, I don't know. I don't even know how to describe it. It just sounds weird. The song sounds weird to me. I love the riffing, and I love a lot of the riffing on this album. This is the last unapologetically thrash metal record by Exodus from this time period. I think the only thing that sucks about this album really is that it's just not like, you take a band like Metallica, they go from Kill 'Em All to Ride the Lightning, which is a huge jump, and then they take a huge jump between Ride the Lightning to Master of Puppets, then a huge jump from, well, that's debatable for some people, a huge jump from Master of Puppets to Injustice for All, and then a kind of a weird jump into the Black Album. But Metallica never gave us the same record two times.
Well, there was that one time where they put out Load and Reload, dude.
This is kind of a case of Exodus putting out a very similar product twice in a row. Maybe even three if you want to count Pleasures of the Flesh. And it's not that any of it's bad. Like I said, I enjoy the overall sound quite a bit. But by the time you get to Impact is Imminent, I can definitely see how it's 1990 and they're unapologetically thrash metal here.
Right. It sounds like the band is in the rhythm of being a professional band at this point. They're writing songs every day. They're going into the session with 20 or 30 songs and then picking the ones that work for this record. I wouldn't say these songs have a B-side feel to them, but it does feel like they're trying to keep up with themselves. It still works. I don't think this album is skippable. I just think the first three have a tone to them, a feeling of enjoyment. This one feels a little forced, and that's not even completely fair to say that it is forced, because if you're stuck in a rut and you got to put a record out, you just got to put the record out. And you're Exodus, so what are we going to do, guys? Well, we're going to play riffs, we're going to play fast, and dude's going to bark. Go!
Right. They're going to do the Exodus thing, and that's fine. Like I said, that's my whole takeaway with this record. And I think that the only reason I think this record's a little bit more boring is it just doesn't really quite stack up to Fabulous Disaster.
I don't think anything does, at least not from this era.
No, definitely not. And I think for the most part, the band kind of realized that. And I think it was like, hey, guys, we're in the 90s now, so a lot of this 80s stuff, it's kind of got to go, you know? This is where we saw a lot of bands go into more of a commercial, like, hard rock territory, whereas they bust out of the gate in 1990 like, hey, we're still Exodus. And that's like an amazing metal sticking to my gun sort of statement to make. But whenever we get over to 1992, even Exodus is starting to kind of question where they're going musically.
Force of Habit.
Let me start this off by saying I like Force of Habit.
I think the production is easily criticized, but it's 1992. Give it a rest, people.
Well, and that's been the hard part too. Is like when I was doing my listen through of Exodus, I noticed that a lot of the streaming versions of the older albums are just like, they sound amazing, and I don't, I have to dig out my actual CDs and see if the CDs sounded as amazing as the stream. I feel like there might have been some remastering going on here. But whenever I jumped out of Impact Is Imminent and went into Force of Habit, I was like, oh man, this sounds like really, really muddy. And I think I know why. I think that the super trebly high end kind of razor sharp sting of thrash metal was kind of a defining aspect of it in the 80s. And so in the 90s, it was all about like crunch, right? Like, how heavy can we get it, And Exodus is no stranger to writing heavy riffs. But yeah, I think the production really, really holds this one back. And you also notice that the vocally, Steve's going for a little bit more of like that hard rock sort of thing. I would say this was the closest they ever got to doing like a Black Album sort of thing, where they were trying to make a more commercial version of thrash metal. The only problem is that instead of just like seamlessly transitioning into a new style like Metallica did, Exodus is still Exodus, so they can't keep the metal in their pants, so to speak. So what you have with this record is a mostly thrash metal album that tries to do a lot of different things. Like I don't know. Like it'll absolutely try to go into more of that hard rock direction that people were really into in like 1992, but I don't think that they're totally successful in that. I think that sometimes they just kind of revert back to what they normally do. And I don't have a problem with that. I could have done without Bitch, which was like not exactly a ska song, but has like horns. And I don't know. I did not like that song at all. I didn't think it sounded very Exodus at all. And I also have to mention that, these guys wrote a song called Fuel for the Fire back in 1992. Just want to throw that out there. Is it as good as Fuel? No, it's better. My opinion.
The last two records, they sound like that 80s movie that you saw. I was talking about horror movies earlier, and I'm going to go back to that for a second. It sounds like what those movies look like. It's a dark street. There's lights in places that there never are after 8 p.m. It's probably wet because it's been raining for the past 3 days and the sun never came out because this is California, right? It's gloomy. There's smog. It's not a pleasant place to look at when it's dark and dingy and just has this attitude, this disgusting oil-drenched attitude that the late 80s would have left on heavy metal records. Now we come to 1992, where people are trying to be a little bit brighter. Maybe they're running around in shorts and t-shirts trying to be as metal as they possibly could. And the sun's out because this is a party. So this album, to me, sounds like they're trying to be less dark and dingy, but still be heavy as fuck. It's like they were playing a show or a festival and the sun was out and the breeze was blowing and we were just trying so hard not to be Pantera, but we had to fit in with the times, right? Because music is changing, attitude is changing, appearances are changing, but Exodus is still Exodus. So the production holds this back for most people, but for me, it just sounds different and it really doesn't fail. It's only shocking when you've been listening to all of this band's records and then you get to this point. I don't think you would have had the same reaction in 1992. So are the songs good? They're entertaining. Are they as good as the previous records? Not really, in my opinion, but there are some standouts, and Fuel for Fire is one of them.
Yeah, I think that they wanted to do something different, but I'm not 100% sure they knew how to do that. Which sounds like really insulting, but I don't mean it to be. It's just that, like, I feel like they were a band that got really, really, really good at doing one thing. And whenever they're like, no, you got to change it up to adapt with the times, I just don't know if they were necessarily as quick on the draw with that. But, I think that, unfortunately, it wasn't enough because the band pretty much just, after Force of Habit, it kind of just seemed to have fallen apart for the most part. They kept playing for a while. They kind of meandered around. They got their original vocalist, Paul Bailoff, back in the band. And it was just kind of like, okay, yeah, we're going to do a new record. We're going to do a new record. But it wasn't for like 12 years until they put another one out. And I think think it's actually really sad that they were trying to come back as the original Exodus with the original vocalist. But unfortunately, I mean, they did a lot of stuff with Paul, thankfully. But unfortunately, in 2002, Paul Bailoff passed away. So in order to continue doing their live shows and making all their commitments, they pulled my guy, Steve, back in as the lead vocalist, which I think is really important. I think Steve needed to be the vocalist in the band as long as he was able, or as long as they were getting along with him that week. Because in my opinion, he is the voice of Exodus, and it just wouldn't have felt right without him. In my opinion, I know a lot of people felt that way about Paul, but in my opinion, the guy that's on the most records is the guy.
2004, Tempo of the Damned.
Oh, hell yeah. So now in 2004, metal's different than it was in the mid-90s, isn't it?
Don't tell Exodus that.
Do not tell them that. This is, I think, as far as metal being more like commercially accessible, like actual heavy stuff. I think the problem is in the 80s, so you had all these thrash bands, right? And they were like, super heavy, super extreme, super in your face. But then you had glam metal, and glam metal was like the commercialization of heavy metal so that, people's girlfriends would buy it, right? And in the 90s, people were more into hard rock than it seemed like metal. Everybody always says, oh yeah, grunge killed metal and all this stuff or whatever. I do believe that grunge absolutely did kill hair metal. But the thrash bands were still doing it, but some of the thrash bands went in more of that grungy hard rock sort of direction, like Metallica, like Megadeth. Slayer did not, because they do what they want.
There was that one time.
Well, yeah, but that was more new metal, right? But Exodus, though, by 2004, metalcore starting to become a big thing in America, and suddenly it's kind of acceptable to be a legitimately heavy band and still be commercially viable. That's the perfect time for an old classic like Exodus to show back up and be like, dude, check out our new album. It's called Tempo of the Damned, and it's the best sounding Exodus record up to this point, because it's got the benefit of 2004 production. So everything hits hard. The drums hit hard. The riffs are heavy. They're fast. They're back to being classic Exodus. They're back to being the band that people became fans of Exodus.
I question whether or not they would have been received in 2004, because if it wasn't hardcore metalcore at that point, it was about to be Gothenburg influenced metalcore. So they were there, they were present, but how many people actually looked up and said, hey guys, look, Exodus is back? Myself excluded, because I definitely noticed, but nobody cared because Dan was walking around saying, listen to Zayo.
I mean, I think that they are... I think that they were... I remember hearing a lot about this record when it came out. I think people were really into it because all these popular like hardcore bands and metalcore bands and stuff, and even in 2004, I wouldn't say it was like necessarily mainstream yet, but a lot of these bands grew up listening to bands like Exodus and Metallica and a lot of At the Gates. So I mean, these bigger bands are wearing Exodus shirts, they're wearing Testament shirts, they're wearing Metallica shirts, they're wearing their influences on their sleeves. So I think that Exodus did really well on this album for name recognition alone. Like, dude, these guys are legit. They're a legit metal band from back in the day. That's awesome. And here they are with this brand new sounding record. And, this record doesn't sound hardcore. It doesn't sound metalcore. It is a 100% straight up in your face thrash metal record.
I was so glad.
I was too. And it's funny because, I know in the context of this conversation, it's like, oh, well, you guys were just complaining that the sound was starting to get a little stale, a little repetitive. You have to understand, this is 12 years later. This is a much longer gap of time. And it's refreshing to hear a record like Tempo of the Damned in 2004. Because you're like, yeah, that right there. People are always like, Because back then, you're kind of going back and forth with people about what metal is or what people think metal is, right? And everybody's like, no, it's Azalea dying. And some people are like, no, it's Killswitch Engage. And people that knew what they were talking about said, no, it's Shadows Fall. Or it's Lamb of God or, any of these bands. But then, the old guy in the background goes, no, you see that one right there? Tempo of the Damned? That's real heavy metal, and it is. And it's got the modern production. And this is something I'm going to get into on the next record as well. There is a type of heaviness and extremity to thrash metal that I think the 80s was not able to properly capture production wise. I know Joe's like blasphemy over there, but
just a little bit, but I'm going to let you have it. I want to hear where this goes.
When you play thrash metal in the same style that you have always played it, but you have newer guitars, you have newer strings, you've got newer everything, you've got modern production, different production tricks, and you're accentuating more on the heaviness of the riffs. You're throwing more bottom end in there that really wasn't there on the 80s records. You start realizing just how heavy bands like Exodus really are, and how heavy bands like Testament really are. And I mean, Exodus even proved that. They went back and they re-recorded Bonded by Blood with the modern lineup. This is a few years later, and it's the same record with a different singer, but it just goes to show that like it's true to the original record, but it is so much heavier being captured with the production qualities of today.
It's 2005. I'm going to let Dan say this one because I know he wants to.
All right, guys, it's 2005. Exodus is back. And their new record, it's called Shovel-Headed Kill Machine. Best album artwork ever.
Have you just looked at a record and said, that looks like Mad Max Fury Road? Even though Fury Road wasn't out yet, don't get ahead of me. It just has that vibe. That dusty, dirty, I can't say bloody because that's obvious, but we have a kill machine. And people ask why I think the Super Mecha Death Christ 2000 is so fucking funny. It's because if you take the time to put something absurd together and then just go with it, it fucking works. And heavy metal is supposed to be a little absurd. Exodus has the best album covers because they get the fucking joke. It's not just about being fantasy. It's not just about giving you a story, even though those are staples of the genre. Sometimes you just got to be ridiculous and say, guys, you know what we got? We got a shovel-headed kill machine. What does that even mean? Well, it looks like this.
I'll tell you what it means. I'll tell you what it means. It's a tank with a giant shovel as its head with lots of miniguns all over it. It looks like there seems to be several cannons or rocket launchers on it, and it is rolling over a hellscape of crushed human skulls.
Do you think the shovel-headed kill machine ever drives through a ditch?
No, it destroys the ditch. I think that, there's one thing that we have to get out of the way right away with Shovel-Headed Kill Machine. The previous vocalist, my guy, Steve Souza, left the band pretty much like during the support for Tempo of the Damned. And they brought in a new guy named Rob Dukes. And Rob Dukes is, he's a little bit more of a more modern vocalist. And what I mean by that is he's more of a screamer, less of a whatever Steve was doing. So he doesn't necessarily sound like evil, but he sounds angry, and he sounds almost a little bit more hardcore, if I'm allowed to say that.
You're allowed to. It's 2005.
And I think that this caused a lot of, metal elitists, idiots mostly, to falsely say that, oh, look at Exodus. They put out this record, Shovel-Headed Kill Machine, and now they're a metalcore band.
This is not metalcore. I'm going to go ahead and say it. If anyone thinks this is metalcore, you are wrong. To quote Dan, you do not know what metalcore is.
Yeah, and if you ever listen to this podcast and you don't know what metalcore is, I'll tell you all about it. But this is like Tempo of the Damned. It's almost like they didn't even miss a beat on this one. This thing comes in swinging, and it's even heavier than Tempo of the Damned. It's not like, again, it's not like a metalcore. They didn't go death metal like Testament did. But they definitely upped the ante as far as how crazy and how almost dumb some of the song titles could be. Death-amphetamine? Like, are you kidding me? You named a song that? That's fine. I mean, they did have that one song, Shroud of Urine, so on the last record, so you get what you get. This is just a good time. It is a ball-bustingly heavy, in-your-face thrash metal album. Do I think it holds up to the old material? Controversial statement. Yes, I do.
I don't think it has to hold up. I think it just needs to be heavy, and it succeeds at being heavy because Exodus is one of the most underrated thrash bands of all time. Spoilers for my final thought. I don't think 2005 was the time everyone was paying attention to this, but they should have been. And for those of us that were still all about riffs, this was one of the big records because it was the opposite of where the popular heavy music was going. This was not chaotic. This was not random. This was not trying to layer upon layer of melody and then call it extreme. This was everything that you heard in the 80s that you loved, that you listened to your cassettes and you enjoy, with better production. And that's kind of the point Dan was talking about earlier, and I'm sure he's going to elaborate on further.
Yeah, I mean, so with Shovel-Headed Kill Machine, clearly it does sound much more modern than any Exodus album. Even Tempo of the Damned. Tempo of the Damned was perfect because it had that throwback quality, but still being heavy enough for like new listeners to get into. Whereas if you started with Tempo of the Damned, and a lot of people my age actually did start with Tempo of the Damned. I did not. I listened to Bonded by Blood when it first came out in 1985, even though I wasn't born yet. But that was a good like kind of throwback record. Shovel-Headed Kill Machine is more of a modern metal release without having the modern metal tropes. It's produced like a modern metal record. Drums are turned way up. Bass is turned way up. Vocalist is more angry. He's more aggressive. He's more screamy, for lack of a better term. Rob is a much more screamy vocalist than Steve was. So I could see how elitists would have said, like, oh, yeah, this is more metalcore or whatever. Whereas I guess if you weren't paying attention, you might be able to think that. But again, I think that these records are so thrash that they could have come out in the 80s or the early 90s and still sounded like 80s or early 90s records. I guess it's not like that big of a point to make, but it is interesting just showing the viability of thrash metal in the 2000s. And we talked about that with Testament as well, that like these bands are putting out some of the most extreme heavy stuff that they've ever put out. And yet at the same time, they've got this fan base. It's like, no, make it sound like 1987. And I guess I just don't get that. For me, it's more the merrier. Like, yeah, keep being extreme, keep being heavy, keep showing people why Exodus matters.
You remember the 87 special, right? That's when I played the CD and turned up the reverb and turned down the bass and the highs and just let it ring.
Right.
And it fucking works.
It's amazing. It works for some people. It doesn't work for me. Bring on this like well-produced, in-your-face, bottom end for days sort of record. And they're going to continue to do that. The Shovel-Headed Kill Machine was not some kind of anomaly.
2007, the Atrocity Exhibition, Exhibit A.
Ah, yes, Exhibit A. I'm glad that you brought up Exhibit A. Exhibit A. In my opinion, out of the last three records, and again, I know people have a lot of different opinions about Exodus, so like, again, feel free to just tear me apart in the comments, but this is my favorite out of the last three records. If you're counting this one to be three, so it's my favorite out of Tempo of the Damned and Shovel-Headed Kill Machine. I like to say Shovel-Headed Kill Machine is my favorite just because it's called Shovel-Headed Kill Machine. But Atrocity Exhibition, there it is probably, in my opinion, it's the heaviest and the most technically sound that they've put out in a while. I think that Rob sounds more, I guess, like himself on this record. I got the opinion, or I got the feeling that Rob sounded a little bit like he was trying to sound a little bit more like Steve on the last record. He didn't sound like him at all, but like he's just, I don't know, he's more coming to his own on this record. And so like I really, really, really enjoy this one. I like that the songs are longer too. It's one of the longest records that I would admit to enjoying. Right at an hour and 1 minute. And I think the solos are great. I think that the times that they do slow down and just go for heavy, I think is incredible. And yeah, it's absolutely one of my favorites. And this also has the best Exodus hidden track in my opinion. Banjo or Bonded by Banjo. It's amazing. Check it out if you like bluegrass or don't.
I think the term modern thrash is best described as an old school sounding band that knows when to slow down. And I think Exodus pulls that off here. The record doesn't sound bigger as much as the ideas sound a little bit bigger. Almost like someone was listening to maybe a Testament record and said, you remember back in the 80s when we used to put clips from random horror movies in our songs? Why don't we do that more? And that leads to pacing, which is something that thrash metal is always criticized for in modern music, I think. So if you can write a really heavy song, but still give it time to develop, I think that's some of the best playing that you can do. And Exodus does that more on this record than they have recently.
I agree. I think this is, spoilers, I think this is the better of the two exhibits that we're going to see. Because this one just comes in out of the gate and it doesn't have, Exodus is not in some sort of weird transitionary period on this record, whereas I feel like for a lot of their career, they always kind of were. Not transitionary musically, but just like always trying to find what the next thing is that's going to like actually catch on and work. But I mean, at this point, they already have Shovel-Headed behind them. They've got Tempo the Damned behind them. These guys didn't need to reinvent the wheel here. And so they just doubled down on doing what they do better. And I think it's like a weird sweet spot in the history of the band where they like are so, I guess, like tuned in. Is that the right word?
I'll let you have that.
All right. They're more tuned in, I guess, than maybe they have been in the past. And even though that makes the record maybe not sound as crazy as some of the other ones, it's not necessarily a speed fest. I do think it's musically one of the most interesting ones that they put out. And yeah, so I couldn't have been more excited about Exhibit B. And well, we'll talk about it.
2010, Exhibit B. The Human Condition.
It is worth mentioning that in between these two, they did put out their re-record of Bonded by Blood. And I actually really, really like it. I think it sounds like a modern version of Bonded by Blood. And I think that what's interesting about it is it 100% proves what I just said earlier about modern production and old thrash metal songs. Unfortunately, with Exhibit B, you have a record that superficially sounds just as good as the last one. It's supposed to be a continuation, and I think it's really, really good. But I wish they had been released in reverse order. This should have been Exhibit A, and Exhibit A should have been Exhibit B. Is everybody paying attention? Yeah.
I was about to criticize this record for being the reload of this pair, but that definitely would not be fair. I would consider a comparison to Anorexia Nervosa before that, because you listen to those two records and you think, okay, I get the story is supposed to be an A-side, B-side thing, but the second half sounds a little too dark, almost like we wanted to put our best foot forward, but then when we got to the second half, we just did something wrong. It doesn't feel right. And that is a little present on this one, I think. But I don't think they wrote these albums as one big piece. I think this was an example of Exodus trying to do a concept, and this record on its own is just not as good as the previous one. But when it's Exodus, it's Exodus. When it's thrash, it's heavy, and I love it. It just has some pacing problems, and that's not enough to completely put me off the record this time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's the same situation we had with Fabulous Disaster and Impact is Imminent, where you just have a record that doesn't quite stack up to the last one. But it's in at least with those records, there wasn't any sort of expectation that they were supposed to be on the same level. Whereas with this one, the titling would lead you to believe that you are experiencing a part two that you're not necessarily experiencing. And I think that really the only thing I can really complain about on it is I just feel like it is starting to sound a little bit stale at this point. I want to hear kind of what Exodus is going to do because I've now heard 3 albums of the same thing, and I love all of it. It is literally the beginning of the career repeating itself again in the later career. So I think I was really interested to see where they were going to go. Eventually, Rob Dukes left the band, and they brought back in my boy, Steve, Mr. Evil himself, to put out what I think is one of my favorite Exodus records of all time.
I've been waiting for this one for one very specific reason. 2014, Blood In, Blood Out.
Oh man, we got zombies eating flesh with a giant skull behind it with fire in the sky. This is Exodus, ladies and gentlemen. This one has kind of, not to double up on the Iron Maiden episode, but this one kind of has that X factor that I think that maybe the last couple albums were missing. I feel like the band was getting so heavy that they were starting to lose a little bit of their individual identity. Like what makes Exodus Exodus, and I felt like maybe with Exhibition B that they had just kind of started becoming another heavy thrash band, and they didn't have the identity of Exodus that they had kind of before that. But in my opinion, bringing Steve back on vocals is a huge help because now they kind of have the last piece of their signature sound back. And the guitar solos on this record, the lead work in general, is just so much more gnarly. It's a little bit more like it's more guitar driven, I guess, which is I know a crazy thing to say while talking about a thrash metal band, but but it is in a way. It's more lead guitar driven. Whereas I feel like there was a little bit more focus on the rhythmic on the previous records. I like all of it, but I really like this. I feel like this is in a lot of ways more of a follow up to Tempo of the Damned than a continuation of Exhibit A, Exhibit B, you know?
I know Josh isn't here, but do you want to take some time to talk about Salt of the Wound?
Get your places, everybody, because it's about to get raw.
Oh, well, I don't want to speak for him.
I think you can. I think you know what he would say.
$1 at a time.
Hey, everybody, Kirk Hammett played a guitar solo on Salt of the Wound. Or Salt the Wound. You happy?
I'm 100% happy, dude. I love any time we get that thrash record that just feels and sounds modern. We've been talking about that a lot recently with our Judas Priests, with our Coffin Trains. We are talking about a band that, much like Testament, really never stopped doing what they're doing. So I feel like I failed you all. I haven't been talking about Exodus this whole time, and I should have been, because here is Blood In, Blood Out, a very modern-sounding thrash record down to the extreme thrash vocals that I know Dan loves, but just doesn't always embrace, because sometimes you just can't appreciate the guy that's shrieking the way that this guy does. But then again, I'm talking about the ultimate Chuck Schuldiner fan. My point, you're missing
evil.
out. You're missing out. You are missing out if you're not listening to Exodus and you are a fan of heavy metal, because they might have the measuring stick that everybody else put down, with the exception of Testament, of course.
And Sepultura, they're still doing a thrash thing. I gotta throw that in there.
I feel like it's that time. Final thoughts on Exodus. Dan.
Well, I mean, Exodus is one of the greatest heavy metal bands of all time. Greatest thrash bands of all time. They have one of the most consistent discographies that I've heard recently. So many bands just want to go all over the place. Exodus doesn't want to go all over the place. Sometimes they cave and go in a slightly different direction. But there's just something I like about a group of dudes that just decided one day that they wanted to make thrash metal. And now, when did they start? 1979. So let me do some quick metal math here. Let's see, 79, 89, 99, 2009, 2019. So yeah, 40 years later, they're still doing that thing that they decided that they wanted to do. And I think that's amazing.
And despite a couple delays, we're supposed to get a new album this year.
We are, and I was kind of holding off, but the way these things end up going, I'm just like, I just want to talk about Exodus. I've waited too long. We can always circle back and talk about the new record and during on a Patreon episode.
I think Exodus is one of the bands everybody talked about back in the day, and some people just forgot because they looked for something heavier. And I think when Exodus plays heavy metal, when they play thrash metal, and they just don't let up, there is no reason why they would be left behind the way they seem to be. But they're still putting out records. They're still playing riffs. And at least for this album, they are shrieking like you have not heard for 3 decades now. So sit back, relax, and enjoy some Exodus. It's what you're looking for when you're looking for the next heavy thing. It just happens to be that it's been heavy and it's been here the whole time. Dan, what's your album of the week?
Always has been. My album of the week is The Crimson Corridor by Zayo. I'm sorry. I love it. I'm going to have to start listening to other things, broadening my horizons, all that. That's what the show's for.
We might have to retire that one before too long.
Maybe you can retire it.
Well, I decided to go a completely different direction this week because when Exodus reminds you that that style you love never really went away, you start looking for other bands that played a style that you don't hear anymore. So in my journey, I found Monster Magnet. Haven't listened to that band in a long time. So this week I spent a lot of time listening to Powertrip because Space Lord, motherfucker.
There it is.
Oh, there's no time like the present. Take us out, DFT.
I will take you out to the ball game. If you've ever been listening to our podcast and you would like to have a conversation with us or reach out to us or give us band suggestions, there's a lot of different ways you can do that. You can reach out to us on Facebook at facebook.com/discography discussion. We are on Twitter at discussmetal. We are on Instagram at discussmetal. We are on YouTube at discussmetaldan. We are on, where's the other places we're at? We're on Twitch, right? I said Twitch, twitch.tv/discussmetaldan. We play a lot of Doom. Sometimes Joe plays with me. You can send us an email at danandjoeshow@gmail.com. Or you could join our Discord server where there's people talking all the time about movies, video games, music, the show, memes, so many memes for days. There will be a link to our Discord server in the show notes. Hope to see you guys there and chat with you guys there. And if you ever want a discography discussion t-shirt or some discography discussion socks, we do have a Teespring store, which is high quality products on demand with our logo on it. There'll be a link to that in the show notes as well. So I hope to hear from you guys very, very, very soon.
And on that note, this has been episode 229 of Discography Discussion. Thank you for listening. You can like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at discussmetal. Subscribe to our podcast everywhere you listen to podcasts, including Google Play, Apple Podcasts, and Stitcher. Visit discussmetal.com for all things discography discussion. And please send questions and comments to danandjoeshow@gmail.com. If you are not a patron, you can become one at patreon.com/discussmetal. We have some sweet perks.
Hey, Joe, can I borrow some nickels?
$1 a month gets you into that exclusive album review feed.